My name is Damon Barr, and this is the Nebraska Garden. A topic that I found a lot while researching how to garden when I first started was square foot gardening. The idea is to cram as many plants as possible into a small space, typically in raised beds. So I started square foot gardening. I built all of my raised beds into 4 foot by 4 foot squares, aside from my big horseshoe bed. So there's 16 square feet in each bed. Today I want to discuss if square foot gardening is really worth it. There's a lot of gardening information online, on YouTube especially, that is up for debate. There are a lot of gardening myths that people like to talk about, and read any YouTube comment. Each one is going to vary on the information they'd give. Each one is going to have a different opinion on gardening because it's not really an exact science. There are some things that are indisputable when it comes to gardening, but it all comes down to your experience and what works for you. And what works for me, I have a small space to garden in. I garden in my backyard, and I garden in a tiny portion of my backyard. I mean, I would love to turn my whole yard into just full garden, but I have dogs, and more importantly, I have a wife who would go crazy if I did that. So square foot gardening for me is the most realistic option to get the most bang for my buck. I'm very concerned about not overspending in the garden because the whole point is to save me money on food. So I figured square foot gardening would be the best way to maximize efficiency. So let's take a look at each of my raised beds, and I'll discuss how I'm implementing square foot gardening. This horseshoe bed is about 3 feet wide on each leg with an extra 1.5 feet or so in the middle, and it's like 10 feet long that way. This summer I decided I wanted to go all in on zucchini in this bed for some reason. I don't really know why. Per square foot gardening, zucchini is recommended to have a 3 foot by 3 foot space, so 9 square feet in total. If you count up the bed, there should be, since it's 10 feet, 1, 2, 3, then an extra 4, 5, 6, 7. There should be about 7 or 8, depending on how loose you are with the square foot spots for zucchini. But I have 11 zucchini plants in here. I kind of pushed square foot gardening because I wanted to raise my green zucchini vertically. Now that didn't actually pan out. I never ended up pruning them correctly, and I kind of just gave up on that idea, which I know, boo-hoo for me, but I think it taught me something. The green zucchini performed a lot worse than the yellow zucchini just because they had half the space per plant. I tried to fit 2 green zucchini in each 3 foot by 3 foot square and basically halved the efficiency of their resource gathering because they had competitors. Going into the fall, after I tear these zucchini plants out, I'll be planting only 7, not trying to do any vertical nonsense, just doing 1 per 3 square foot, and hopefully that will help me A, just have better zucchini overall, and B, help with pests. I have a bit of a squash bug and squash vine borer problem right now, and I think the overcrowded zucchini is not helping my case. So yeah, square foot gardening for zucchini, definitely worth it. Follow the instructions. Don't try to outsmart nature. You're not gonna win that fight. This raised bed is another great example of how I use square foot gardening. In the back here, I have 3 spaghetti squash plants taking up 4 square feet. Now, this is another instance of how I'm trying to cheat square foot gardening a bit. Usually a 2 foot by 1 foot section is required for a spaghetti squash that you grow vertically. I tried to fit an extra one into there, and I've had pretty good success, although I will say, when it comes to square foot gardening, that's how much of an area you have to plant something. It's not how much of an area it's going to take up. This spaghetti squash has been a bane in my side for a long time, and it's kind of starting to look a little unhealthy in here, but that's because there's so much foliage that's spreading through my entire garden. This whole pathway was blocked at one point, and it was impossible for me to access my cucumbers behind there for a little bit. So I gave it a little trim, and I have multiple spaghetti squash growing right now in many different directions. It doesn't grow vertically like the plants themselves. They're not putting the fruit on the vertical part, so I'm beginning to think that doing spaghetti squash vertically isn't worth it at all. I think I should have just dedicated maybe this whole bed to a few spaghetti squash plants and let them just take up area on the ground. But I have a pretty good system going on because the fruits occupy the paths. They don't need to be in the soil. They don't need to be watered. They can be under the leaves, protected from the sun, and it's fine. And in this row, these 4 feet, I have chives over there, which I planted in the spring, and I'm not quite sure that was a terrific idea, but they don't seem to be that old. But I planted arugula in these 3 square feet, so there's 12 or 11, I don't really know how many arugula plants in here. And the great thing about the setup I have here is the spaghetti squash on the trellis blocks a lot of that sun from these arugula, and in the morning they don't get too hot. They do get full south facing sun every day, but they don't get too much. And I think that's really good for a plant like arugula that kind of is a cooler weather crop. Now over here I have planted cucumbers. I think the convention for square foot gardening is every square foot gets 2 cucumbers. So that's what I tried to adhere. This is a square foot with 2 cucumbers, square foot with 2 cucumbers, so on and so forth. Some of them didn't fully germinate. I might have just done 7 or 8. I might have just wildly guessed and filled these rows how I saw fit the day of, not really adhering to the rule, because the square feet are getting smaller as I encroach this way just because of the spaghetti squash and the beast that it is. And so me trying to perform square foot gardening here might bite me because there's not enough resources, but I think I've been able to get away with it so far, so I'm not too concerned about it. And don't even get me started on this raised bed right here. This one is a complete mess, but I'm totally adhering to all of the rules, maybe +1 here and there. Maybe I was supposed to prune a small plant and I just let it grow, sue me. So I have cantaloupe here that are growing vertically, so they take up less space, but they've also sprawled all over. But there are a ton of cantaloupe growing down there, so I don't really want to mess with any of it. We have cucumbers over here. There are 3 cucumbers that occupy a 2x1, so I could have one more in there, and I planted one and it didn't survive. So I have less than the maximum amount in there, and the amount of cucumbers that it's producing is crazy, definitely worth it. I have loofah gourds here that I totally went overboard with. I planted more than I was supposed to with these, but that's fine. I'm kind of excited to see how they grow. I trellised all of them, so I'm hoping that that saves me a little bit, and they have some room to grow with the path here. I do have okra plants inside all of this mess as well, taking up about 2 foot squares, 2 sets of 2 foot rows, so probably I would say 4 square feet. I had to do the math there on that one. And they're growing just fine. They seem to be doing totally okay. They're getting blocked from the sun, which I think is pretty good for a plant like that. They're not getting super scalded during the day. And all of this leaf coverage is actually providing a lot of coverage. The sun is hot. We're having high 90s days, 100-degree days here right now in Nebraska. So all of the leaf coverage is great. I'm hoping that I get a lot of fruit off the cantaloupe and the loofah. I'm already getting fruit off the cucumbers. Square foot gardening for these plants together has totally been worth it so far. And the principle of square foot gardening, which is to save space, definitely goes hand in hand with container gardening. I went a little overboard with the buckets this year, I will admit. I wanted to save money on raised beds. I got free buckets. I thought, hey, let's do a ton of these. I ended up spending a lot of money on dirt just to fill them, so take that as you will. And I kind of crammed 2 peppers into most of these buckets because I saw that you could, and I've honestly not experienced any downsides to that. Some of my peppers are smaller than they might be. My eggplants are smaller than they probably should be. I probably didn't need to do 2 per container in those, but with the peppers, I feel like it's been totally fine. Having 2 in each bucket means I have 32 or 30, depending on how many buckets I have. I haven't counted in a while. I would treat every bucket as 1 square foot. And I think if you look in the square foot gardening guide, I'm not 100% sure, peppers get 1 square foot each. So technically, you could say you're adhering to square foot gardening by container gardening, but I think as long as you're trying to maximize on the amount of food you can grow in 1 small space, then you're doing something good. You're following the cut and clear, and I definitely don't regret doing them in buckets. However, I'm not gonna do as many buckets next year. It's getting a little late here, so I figured I better wrap up this video. If you wanna learn more about square foot gardening, please check out the Square Foot Gardening book. That's literally the source of all of this. I put a link in the description. You can check that out if you'd like. There's a ton of other YouTube videos on square foot gardening. I'm not gonna go into the list of every single plant spacing because you should really check out the book if you wanna see that. And there are just quick Google searches away. So you should be able to find that information pretty easily. I do wanna tell you to be careful about people trying to sell you something when they talk about square foot gardening. On YouTube especially, there's a big e-commerce thing going on with gardeners. The biggest channels have e-commerce sites. A lot of channels have seed shops. And it's important to, when you're watching a YouTube video or any piece of media for that matter, to be knowledgeable about what the point is of the video. I'm creating this video with the intention of getting people introduced to gardening. I'm trying to grow my YouTube channel and one day maybe turn this into a business. I don't know. But I'm not trying to sell you anything right now. I'm just trying to sell you on the idea that if you have a small space, like a backyard or even a patio, square foot gardening might be a way to introduce more plants into your garden and get a way for you to grow more food so that you can feed yourself and you can save money on food. That's the whole point of this. You don't need to buy a fancy raised bed. You don't need to buy fancy water grids unless you're into that stuff and you want to spend money on that, but you don't need any of that. All you need is dirt And that's really it to do square foot gardening. You need pretty much, you can do it in the ground. You don't even need raised beds. So if you want to do square foot gardening, please check out all of those resources. If you made it this far in the video, I appreciate you. Happy gardening.